Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, and this year, the United States Philatelic Classics Society. I am Susan Smith, the Winton M. Blunt Research Chair at the National Postal Museum. Our presenter for this evening's session will be Gordon Eubanks. He will be speaking on the postal history of the issue of 1847. It is my pleasure to introduce Gordon Eubanks. Gordon is retired and serves on the boards of several private technology firms and frequently advises emerging technology companies. He also currently serves on the board of the U.S. Philatelic Classics Society and is a member of the Collectors Club, the Royal Philatelic Society London, and other organizations. He served on the board of the Philatelic Foundation for 2 years and is a member of the Council of Philatelists at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Gordon collects, researches, and studies the first issues of the United States, the issue of 1847, and the issues of 1851-56. He has exhibited both of these issues and has won national grant awards. His exhibit of the issue of 1847 won the American Philatelic Society's Champion of Champions in 2012, and a large gold award at Australia 2013. He has also written a number of articles for the Chronicle of U.S. Classic Postal Issues in both 1847 and 1851 sections. Gordon, please.
Thank you. Certainly a pleasure to be here, and I welcome everyone that I can't see. So I'm going to talk about the postal history of the issue of 1847. Obviously, we can't cover all aspects of the postal history, but taking a look at a few areas that people can expand on. The post office, when they issued the stamps, that was somewhat of a victory, but the post office really didn't get what they wanted with the first issue. What the post office wanted was to prepay all mail. I mean, if the mail was sent and collect, so much of it never got picked up, but the post office had to deliver the service. Patrons, of course, wanted a lower cost. So by little past the middle of the 1850s, the post office got to what they really wanted: use stamps and prepay. So the first stamps are pretty simple. These are some nice examples. The one on the right's the Bible block that was found in a Bible, I guess. Makes sense, I guess. Most mails during this period did not have stamps. Most mail was either sent collect or was sent paid, but not with stamps. I'm going to start showing some of these items and talking about it. Here's the earliest recorded use of the first issue. It's not what I would call a pretty stamp at all, a pretty cover at all, but it's certainly historic. The earliest known use of the 47 was a 10-cent on 2 July that's at the National Postal Museum on loan from Bill Gross. I'll probably say it a couple times, but if you haven't been to the Postal Museum, you're truly missing out. It's a great group of people and a great exhibits. But this is the earliest 5-cent, which is our first stamp. In New York, the stamps were first delivered to New York, and then from New York, they went to other cities. A person actually carried them from city to city and gave them to the postmaster. That cancel is the New York square grid, a really nice example of that cancel, although not too dark. Now, the 5-cent stamps had a lot of issues. There were the plate wore as it was used. And here's an example of a very worn plate, 1851. This is late in the use of the stamp and late in the printings of the stamp. It also has a very unusual green cancel and an unusual 6-bar cancel. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but clearly the an area that people can collect and collect reasonably are the different types of cancels on the stamps, the colors of the cancels, the shades of the stamps. The 5-cent stamp varied in all these areas: the shades, the impression, how it wore. The 10-cent stamp, on the other hand, had no problems at all. Like it was just, the color was constant. There was no noticeable wear. And of course, there were less of them printed because they were less common. In canceling or killing the stamp, the government really only authorized 2 ways in their sort of operational manuals. One was to use an X with ink, and the other was a 7-bar grid shown below on the cover below. Now, most postmasters followed this. Only the larger postmasters were even given the 7-bar grid to cancel. But this is I think something that people think the ink cancel, that's kind of an inferior stamp. It may be, but that was what every postmaster was authorized to do and was considered correct. They unfortunately didn't tell them to tie the stamp. I don't understand why they didn't do that, but they just told them to put an X on the stamp. The Swift is a very common correspondence. He was a traveling salesman writing back to his wife in Massachusetts, and so there's a lot of them available from the Swift correspondence in different cities. Cover at the bottom is just incredibly beautiful, in my opinion. The cancellation was almost always in red because it worked on both stamps. There are some unusual colors that are found. This is a particularly attractive orange, but again, you can find them in orange, magenta, ultramarine, green, and violet, as well as red, blue, and black. The orange, magenta, ultramarine, the green, the violet, that's about 2% of the known cancels. So these unusual colors are quite rare. Green being the least common except for violet. Anyway, this is a beautiful cover to the UK. That shilling mark applied in England was a hand stamp that they used. They did a great job of on this cover canceling it. Some post offices, though, kind of did their own thing. They would they'd draw pictures on the stamps. They would make cancellation devices. Here's a couple of very uncommon but fancy cancellations. A Trenton Star. You got to love this postmaster because he used his ink aggressively so you could see it instead of being faded. The one below on the 10-cent stamp is from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and it's a scarab. I showed a picture in the lower left about scarabs, and I wasted a couple, 3 hours reading about them on Wikipedia. It's actually interesting. They're based on a beetle, a dung beetle, and that was a thing in Egypt in the very ancient days. And how they made this scarab, I'm not sure. It's oblong. And unfortunately, they're kind of hard to, all of them are this way. The postmaster was very accurate, so they're generally completely on the stamp. And they appear on 5-cent and 10-cent stamps from St. Johnsbury. But there's a whole lot of unusual cancels. you could build a whole exhibit, a whole collecting area on color of cancel, on different towns, on different fancy cancels. So to back up to kind of a review of the postal rates. Now, these rates were effective 1 July, 2 years before the stamps. Many of you probably know the history. In the UK showed that a low rate could be effective, that it worked. The US was almost a decade behind them, but or half a decade for the lower rates. Most postage was under 300 or over 300. The 3,000 mile rates are quite uncommon. Drop rates, circular rates, because there were no stamps, you don't find those with 1847 stamps. There are some, they're quite unusual. And then every half ounce, the rate was repeated. So a whole ounce was 10 cents under 300, 20 cents over 300. The triple rate is the most interesting because that was eliminated on 3 March 1848 because they wanted to align with the rates in the UK for international mail. So the triple rates that occurred in the period when they were really triple rates are very cool covers. So I want to start by showing a really unique cover. Not in the best shape. This could probably be cleaned up, but I would never think of doing anything to it. But it is, I say, unique. This is a cover that has both of the stamps, each one used independently for what they were intended to be used for. One pays the 5 cents paying under 300 and the 10 cent paying over 300. And the reason is forwarding, you had to pay the forwarding just like it was an original letter. There's no discount for forwarding, and you had to pay. The addressee was on duty in Albon, New York, with the Erie Canal on the canal board of some sort. And so he probably left stamps with the postmaster to forward his mail. But I don't know of any other cover in 1847 that shows both stamps used properly on one cover. This came from the Mirsky collection. It was one of his favorite covers, and I feel really lucky to have the cover. So here's another more complicated Boston cover. The letter was over an ounce, unpaid 10, a double rate letter over a half ounce, paying over the 300 mile rate. And the 20 is a very unusual Boston marking. So this collection of rates can have a whole bunch of combinations of underpaid, overpaid, special markings for forwarding, etc. I don't know why I like this cover so much, but it's just I think it's very, very much the way that Boston would mark things. That red crayon indicates that was written in Boston. So here is a triple rate cover, and it's a cover that was used during the period that the triple rate was effective. It happens to be vertical. There's only one other vertical strip of 3. Actually, that'll be up on the auction coming up of the final gross sale auction, which starts tomorrow. It's a cover to Canada, though, so this is the unique domestic vertical 3. But what I think is most interesting about this cover is that it is a true triple rate and was only in effect like short period like we discussed. This is a septuple rate. Once you get past double rate covers in the 47 issue, they are not very common. The large rates, this was under 300 mile, as I said, septuple rate, 7-time rate. And a strip of 3 of the 10 cents, pretty unusual too. And then there were covers that went cross country to California. There are very few of these that survived. It was a 40-cent rate. That's a lot of money in those days. And there weren't 10-cent stamps sent to San Francisco. So this is unique from San Francisco, but you don't find a lot of covers with 47 stamps used from San Francisco. There's less than 10, maybe 8 examples that start in the East Coast and go to the West Coast that have 10-cent stamps. So I'd like to shift from rates. Now, we could spend hours just going through different rates, but I'd like to talk about some different issues around the issue of how they were used. Steam is steam engines, and Scott mentioned this morning, clearly the greatest innovation of the century. The invention of the steam engine and applying it the way it was applied to steamboats and railroads was critical for moving the mail. In a country as large as we were and growing, just didn't make sense to do this by stagecoach. And so river mail and railroad mail were critical. The upper cover, the upper left, is Hudson Mail up the Hudson River. That's their cancel that was used on this line. It's some number of bars, escapes me. And the lower right is a railroad and use that unique cancel. 2 beautiful stamps. But what's really interesting is they represent the increasing use of steam power to move the mail. This again is a whole study. There are lots and lots of directions and books that have been written just about mail carried by either ships or by railroads. The last day of legal use was 30 June. These are both used on the last day. The one on the top there's one other known. It's in the National Postal Museum in the Miller collection. You got to go there and see the Miller collection, and of course lots of other stuff, but there's amazing items there. There's a book about the Miller collection that Ken Lawrence and Scott Tuple wrote. You know, I like these because, you know, the last day of use, the day before, sort of like second place, doesn't mean as much. But these are just 10-cent and uses of the stamps over 300 miles, single rate. And then, unusual, for no reason that I can understand, the post office demonetized the stamps. They just, very quickly, the middle of July, they demonetized them. So people had a certain amount of time to turn them in, and the requirements in turning them in was you had to go to the post office you bought it, or a post office that originally got stamps. There was a lot of complicated rules around this, and people kept using them. And what's interesting is it's much easier to find a demonetized use that was accepted, in other words, broke the rules, than it is to find one that followed the rules. I think people used common sense in those days. We must have lost that somewhere along the line. But I think a postmaster said, this is a 3-cent letter. The person paid 5 cents for the stamp. Why should I tell him that he has to pay another 3 cents to send a letter from New York to Connecticut? The interesting thing about this cover is it was the first day. So it would have been particularly unfair on July 1st to tell them you probably put the stamp on yesterday, but now the stamp's no good. But you see these used into the 52s, a lot of in 52. And I like it that the postmasters use common sense. It's a little different than the Civil War demonetization, where there were large supplies of stamps in the South, and the government had a legitimate reason not to want them to be used in the hands of what were our enemies. Now I'm going to show a few kind of unusual different covers. I love this cover. It's Quaker dated. I didn't know what that meant when I first got it, but you'll notice it's the 7th month, the 28th day. It happened to be in 1850. The Quakers believed that the names of the months were demonic, or some word that I'm not pulling up right now, but they were not to be used. And so their dates are dated this way. This is a particular interesting letter because it went from Sandy Springs to Maryland anyway. What's cool about it is the Quaker dating, but the story behind it is that in Sandy Springs, the postmaster, his house is still there, and they found he would on the side made hand stamps for people, and including the different secretaries in the government. And when the Secretary of State at the time moved in, they found some Secretary of State from 150 years ago. Anyway, cool place, Sandy Springs, still there. This is another really unusual letter. It tells a lot about how the post office worked. I don't know that there's any other letter with this combination of markings, but it was sent to Cincinnati to a woman, Miss Peck, and she didn't come and pick it up at the post office. Those days there was no delivery in Cincinnati. So when it wasn't picked up, the postmaster was required to advertise it in the paper. And I was actually able in the archives at the museum there to find the paper where it was advertised. I don't have a picture of it in this presentation, but if the person then saw it in the paper and came and picked it up, they would pay a 2-cent fee for advertising. But it wasn't picked up because it went to the dead letter office. And the dead letter office, and notice there wasn't a lot of time. I mean, it was postmarked April 10th and got to the dead letter office on May 30th. The dead letter office would get huge numbers of letters that were unclaimed. So the dead letter office would literally dump them in a trough. They pull them out, open them up. If there were no valuables in it, they were destroyed. If they found valuables in it, they entered it in a log, which is the 132-8, and then they made an effort to find the person. So for this letter to exist, this envelope to exist, they had to actually find either the sender or the recipient and deliver whatever was in the letter, the valuable. I have tried and tried to find these logs, but I think they were destroyed, and a lot of stuff was destroyed at one point in the archives. But a lot in this cover: advertised, dead letter, person, someone's found, either sender or receiver. And this is just a close-up of this. So I want to shift to another aspect that came into play in the 47 period. Originally, as I said, letters were sent collect. In the Americas, people did not believe in prepaying for service. They expected to pay when the service was delivered. So letters, when they were delivered, they would pay, pick up the letter, pay for the postage. But over time, more and more people were expected to pay the postage. Merchants, politicians, organizations that were advocating for a particular position or area of interest. So as that happened, and then political organizations got into this. So as this happened, they began to use the envelope for advertising or marketing. And this is very common as you get to the mid-50s and the 60s, and all the way up really to World War II. There's some amazing, after World War II and before television took over, amazing envelopes with marketing messages. This is an example. Here's a manufacturing company. This is baking powder. It made baking soda. Put their logo on the envelope since they had to pay the postage. This may be one of the most beautiful. Harvey Mirsky also owned this. I believe I sometimes get this mixed up, but I believe this was the first cover he bought. For those of you who knew Harvey, you know this, but those who don't, he was a real marketeer, a seriously talented marketeer. And he saw this advertised going to be sold. He went to the auction at Siegel and bought it. And that was his first cover, first item he bought. That's my understanding, but whatever. It's a great and beautiful cover. So here's another interesting story. This is an engraved cover from done in England, manufactured in England, and used in the U.S. Very late use, June of 51, 2 weeks before it was demonetized. This gentleman was a well-known advocate of Native American rights. He had lived with Indians most of his life. He was from Canada. He came down to the U.S. He lived growing up with Indians. This cover was sent to market a newspaper that he was going to start about American Indians and Indian affairs. May not be politically correct today, but it's incredibly beautiful piece of art from 170 years ago or so. And then people did fun things. This is a very famous correspondence, the Turner correspondence. There were a lot of letters that were sent between Charles Sawyer and his fiancée, E. Turner, who lived in Boston. And a few of them are they're known for overlapping. There's one of them in the gross sale that's coming up, this, as I mentioned, is coming up starting tomorrow. A beautiful example. A gentleman, Mark Shearer, I'm going to mention him later, but Mark got interested in this, and he and I worked on a census of these covers. But Mark was able to find the family, figure out that Charles Sawyer was writing. These are envelopes, there's no letters. He figured out it was Charles. He found a grandson that had written a book about the couple, sort of their history, and found the book online and put together a great story. And this is, to me, what postal history, you know, the fact that they're on this envelope on top of each other, you know, people pay a lot more than I think they're worth, but except when I'm selling them, then they're obviously worth a lot more. But it's the story behind it. It's the history of this. And I actually have a hard copy now of that book that talks about the family. She was in Boston. He was working in St. Louis. He came back to Boston, married her, and they moved to Chicago, where he had a very successful career. We've been talking about domestic mail, domestic rates. I'd like to just end this with a few examples of international mail. It's surprising how far spread the 1847 stamps went, considering the times that they were allowed to be used. So not just Canada, but Central, South America, Europe, and there's a cover that went to England and then on to Africa. There's some very surprising destinations. Just to throw in as an aside, one of the driving forces to the really strange destinations were missionaries, and much more of this as the years went by, even up into the World War II. There were missionaries around the world. So here's a letter envelope that beautiful cover. This went from Canada and paid the 10-cent US postage or the 6-pence Canadian postage with both a US and a Canadian stamp. This is a unique example of a full cover going from Canada with both the first issues of both countries. There's another envelope that goes from the US to Canada with the first issue of both. And then there's a cover with a huge number of 5-cent stamps and one beaver that's going to England. So every one of these three are different and unique. In Canada, until the Treaty of 1851, 6 June, I think. I'm probably not right on that exact date, but until then, we had no postal treaty, and the mail went directly to the border, and we paid to the border. Either in the 57, in this period, we paid either 5 or or 10 cents to the border, depending on how far, and then and also how heavy the envelope was. And then the Canadian postage was paid by the person that received the mail. Then Canada issued stamps. There was no formal law that both parties agreed to a treaty or a law that said you could use a mixed franking like this, but they did. In the 51 period, they had mixed frankings also, but the law explicitly did not allow that. While they're cute, or they're very attractive envelopes, they're not actually following the law. But it was not mentioned one way or another, and I guess occasionally was used. There's a few pieces too with just the two stamps and a part of an envelope. So this is a letter to a less common destination, Prince Edward Islands. I say I should say this Kennedy Esquire is a massive correspondent, a banker in New York that was doing business in Canada. And you see a lot of Kennedy envelopes. This may be as nice as they come, maybe not. So here is a letter to Prince Edward Island. When the rate to Canada had a through rate of 10 cents from the US, the Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, they actually did not have that in effect, and you had to pay to the border. You can see in the upper left, just to the left of the postmark, that's the rate that from the border to the recipient on Prince Edward's Island. Now this is really not a very attractive cover. There's a lot of nicer covers to Prince Edward Island. But what's really interesting about this is that to get the letter to Prince Edward Island, they had to transit the Northumberland Strait, and they did that on what's they called ice boats. There's a whole museum up there. You can see these boats and read about it. But here's a photo of as they tried to get across in the winter, there were places where it was frozen and you had to drag the boat across the ice. Now, the passengers that were paying for this would get a discounted rate if they helped pull the boat. Interesting. Now they have a bridge. I don't know why I've always loved Cuba. My father used to go there on business in the 50s and early 60s. Spent a lot of time in Cuba. Probably don't want to know what he was doing down there, but he's on business. But there are very few letters with stamps in this period going to Cuba. One of the reasons, of course, is there wasn't a rate that could be paid with stamps. It was 12.5-cent rate. This letter was started in New York, entered the mail in Charleston, and went on Cuba. I remember the first time I saw a picture of this was when I was getting a invaluable lesson about 47s in Cuba from one of the speakers coming up, Emil. I remember that so well. I always wanted to find one of these covers. Now, in the rates, the ships from California would go through Panama or Nicaragua. The U.S. had a rate from letters from Panama to the U.S., most of the covers you find from Panama pay the 30-cent rate for the West Coast. This is the only one known that pays the 20-cent rate on the East Coast, up the East Coast to New York. This was one of the really great covers in the Gross collection. But I'm not sure why there's so few that go up the East Coast. Letters from South America, this letter is from Peru, would go to the Panama. The mail agent in Panama had a supply of 10-cent stamps, and he would apply them with payment from the mail agent that was handling it for the mail from, in this case, Peru. This pays 3 times the 30-cent West Coast rate. The stamp in the upper right is a replacement. In other words, a real 10-cent stamp put on top of, hinged on top of a stamp that was ripped off. It's partly there, partly not. Very ugly, but obviously a unique and interesting cover. So you might ask, if this was going to Mexico, why would it have U.S. stamps? It never went to the U.S. territory, never touched U.S. territory. But the mail agent in Panama would apply the stamps and the rate to get to the U.S., but the boat would stop along the way in Mexico, offload some mail for Mexico, and that's how mail got to Tepic, Mexico. I think that's a particularly great story. Now here's another one that started in Philadelphia, went through Panama to Chile. There's a very, and I've never seen anything else from the 1844 convention with New Granada, which allowed the mail to be transferred in New Granada, transferred to the British, who would then take it to Santiago, and the marking there is the payment in Santiago. By the way, Santiago is a great place to visit. Not that I'm getting paid to advertise that, but it is great. I'm just showing this because I just love this cover. So this is a cover that paid the 5-cent postage from Boston to New York, where it caught the Cunard boat to London, not to London, but to Liverpool. And it was a double rate letter. So the US postage was 10 cents. And then in England, instead of the very common or more common 1 shilling, it was 2 shilling. I believe this is the only letter with the stamps that have that full 2 shilling marking on it. There are other items that have other non-US items. I wrote an article about this for the Chronicle way back. But I don't know how covers can get too much prettier than this. It's not a rare cover. I mean, it's a double rate cover to England. But I love the way the marketing in the red. So I want to end with a cover I've always coveted. This has been in many, many great collections, including Steve Walski, who has an amazing eye, because if you look at the things he's owned, and owns. But this cover is paying the retaliatory rate to Belgium through London. So the retaliatory rate had to do with getting it to England, and then it paid extra to get it from England to Belgium. I'm not going to go through the detailed logic of the way it's rated, but it's a unique cover to Belgium during the retaliatory rate period, going through the UK to France to Belgium. I don't know. There's probably 3 or 4 dozen of them called the rarest and most beautiful U.S. covers, but in my mind, this is certainly up there. The retaliatory rate is interesting. I recommend Mark Schwartz's single frame on the retaliatory rate. If you don't think it's very complicated, I mean, on one level, it's the U.S. would pay postage to England. England would ignore it and charge as if the postage hadn't been paid. That sounds very simple, but it's actually a little more complicated. And he has a great single frame that talks about this. You'll find it on the Classics Society website. So I really appreciate you attending. I know it's not the same as being in person. Besides thanking all of you, I'd also like to thank some of the people that really make this information available. The Siegel Auction Galleries has on their website a power search, and if you want to know who's owned something, that you can find it there so fast, and it's completely free. And they have all the catalogs there too, again, free. But Provenance, if you want Provenance, I'll tell you, you get it at the power search at their site. And the Classic Society census that Mark Shearer, I mentioned him earlier. Mark, I've never met him in person, but he's amazing. He came to us with a spreadsheet that he had created based on the Alexander book of all the 47 covers. He then went through every catalog he could find and continued to update it, and then turned it into a database, which is the Classic Society's 47 census. There's other censuses there too that the Classic Society has supported. And of course, the many philatelists whose research all of us rely on that have been studying these stamps for decades. Anyway, thank you, and I think there may be some questions.
There absolutely are. Thank you so much, Gordon. That's fantastic. Lots of questions. I'm going to use the host prerogative here and ask one of my own. Is there any evidence that the fancy cancels about which you talked were used at post offices that had officially received the 7 grid cancels, and those post offices that received the grid cancels, did they also receive the ink? Is that why the red is so common?
To the best of my knowledge, the post offices weren't given ink, but they were giving the device. I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that they just received the canceling devices, but only the bigger post offices. And remember, most post offices did not have stamps. So it's interesting. You know, by the time we really got to what the British did, prepay with stamps, we were 10, 15, 17 years behind them.
And did the larger post offices ever have the fancy cancels, or did they, if they had the grids, they used the grids?
Some used the grids, some used their own cancel. New York, of course, did not use the grid. Finding a 47 with the 7-bar grid from New York is unusual. I believe some foreign mail had it, but I'm not sure if they had it in the 47 period. I do not own a 47 from New York with a 7-bar grid.
Okay.
But go to the search and the power search, and you can probably find one.
Do you know if that grid was created around the time of the introduction of the 1847 stamps, or if it had been used before the stamps?
Well, before stamps, there was no need for a grid cancel, so they did a. I don't believe they had any use for it. Any use in canceling stamps, because there were no stamps. There may have been some other use for the grid, which they just said, hey, let's just use this for canceling the stamps. One thing, though, is that in the pre-stamp period, some postmasters created very fancy markings or stamps to show that something was paid. And some of them were used also with stamps.
Okay, and do you know anything about the Elizabeth Taylor mentioned on the slide with the two covers from the Sawyer Turner correspondence?
You mean the actress Elizabeth Taylor? Oh, the woman in the Turner correspondence. Yes, she was I believe a nurse in Boston, but she and her future husband were engaged. He was sent to St. Louis to work for some period of time, and he corresponded with her as any good fiance would. There aren't any letters after they got married because they lived together. They stayed together their whole life and were in Chicago. But this is what makes postal history, I think, exciting, is finding these things out.
Could you, first of all, could you explain what a drop rate was?
So up until late, past the 40s, the 1940s, post offices, if you were sending a letter to someone that was in the post office, that was in the same post office, that was called a drop letter. You'd hand it to the postmaster would put it in the person's box, and you had a reduced rate. In the 1940s, there were two different rates depending on whether and before the 40s, depending on whether the person was at a post office with carrier delivery or one that had no carrier delivery and only post office boxes. So I've been trying to explain this to my post office. We don't have delivery, we just have post, but they won't give me a discount on the mail, even though they just have to stick it in actually it has to go to Salinas and back because of the way it works. Anyway, so drop letters were dropped off at the same post office as the addressee.
Okay. How long did it take before all of the post offices in the U.S. had the 1847 issue in stock?
Well, they never all had it in stock. Most did not have it. There were tiny post offices. So the initial group was expanded somewhat, but really not that much. Just bigger cities, bigger post offices. And in those days, you went in general, except for some very large cities like Philadelphia and New York, Washington, you went to the post office, got your mail. It was a social place. It was like going on Facebook, I guess. But I don't believe that it's a great question. I should know the answer to what percentage had it, but they never all had them.
Someone asked, what did you mean by tie the stamp?
So if you had a stamp and you canceled it, if you're collecting an envelope today, you would like that canceled to also cover the envelope so you can tell that the stamp actually originated. I can't imagine anyone would fake it by putting a stamp on an envelope that didn't have it originally, right. But maybe there are people that do that. I should also say about the overlapping stamps, they were technically illegal. I should have mentioned that. So if you wanted to save 10 cents, which was real money, then you could take a stamp that had just a little bit canceled, put it down, and then overlap it with another stamp. I don't think anyone's ever investigated whether that occurred with the Turner correspondence. That'd be interesting research.
Sure. The rate mark 20 in a circle reminds me of the 20 and 3/4 marking. Was the 3/4 eliminated and the rate mark then reworded?
You obviously know more about Boston than you're putting on. Yes, that was the marking. My understanding, I don't know if Mark's on this call, he would certainly be able to verify, but my understanding is that that marking had the 3/4 and it was removed to be used as a 20.
Okay.
I believe that's right.
Someone also asked, I thought that these stamps were demonetized because the government didn't own the dies or plates. Is that not true?
This is a very long and complicated situation. I don't believe, I mean, that may have been a reason. It may have been a reason that people hypothesized later on. But when the stamps were no longer being printed, the engraver was required to give the dies and the plates back to the government. Now, there's some evidence that the government did not destroy them. There's a great article by Scott Tuple in the Chronicle that discusses this.
Okay. I think you've answered this question, but I'll ask it anyway. You showed a New York grid on the early use of the 1847 5-cent stamp. Was that grid created around the time of the introduction of the 1847s? If not, was it used before the stamps? I think we answered that.
Yeah, well, I don't think there'd be a reason to be using any of these grids before the stamps, but I'm sure I'm going to hear from people if I'm wrong on this. I can't think of any reason. I believe that was created in New York for use with the stamps, but New York had provisionals. And so the New York provisional, I believe, although I'm probably guessing, was canceled by the grid, but you're going to get a chance to hear about that on Friday when Mark gives his talk on the provisional, New York provisional.
Someone wrote in wondering, why are there so few 10-cent stamps with a CDS cancel?
I don't know that there are.
Okay.
I really don't. I don't know that. I've never thought of or heard that there's a whole lot of beautiful socked on the nose town cancels on 47 stamps, and some of them were on 10 cent. The rules again were you to do the town postmark, and then you were to kill the stamp. But in bigger post offices, particularly, I'm sure the people were, thought, well, geez, I can do both with one hammer thing, and started hammering the stamps. And there was a lot of reused stamps. You'll find stamps were reused, cleaned, and everything. So maybe the postmasters wanted to really be sure they were mucked up.
Sure. How common was cutting the 10-cent stamps diagonally to make a 5-cent stamp? Why wasn't the 5-cent stamp cut diagonally for, say, the 12.5-cent postage?
I don't think there was enough 12.5. There may be somewhere, sometime, there might have been a bisected 5 with a 10 to pay the rate to Canada. That would be a great cover. I can try to whip one of those up. The 10 cent was bisected for a number of reasons. Sometimes there were no 5s available. Sometimes a person had 2 letters and a 10, and they bisected it. It's bisected 3 ways. It's bisected diagonal, actually 4 ways, 2 different diagonals. horizontal, of which there's only one piece available, and that's in the sale coming up starting tomorrow, the horizontal. And then there is the vertical bisect. The thing about bisects is that a horizontal bisect would mean part of the stamp had no rate on it. And I think I have a theory just looking at the bisects that are diagonal that they seem to do it in a way that you could see the X to be sure you knew you were paying half of 10 cents. Mm-hmm. This is my theory, not necessarily proven, but just looking at hundreds of these bisects. The government also put out a letter, a document saying at some point that bisects were no longer valid and people stopped using them.
Do you know of any combination covers with local or carrier stamps or postmaster provisionals?
I don't know of a postmaster provisional with a 47. I realized today that I hadn't added the locals and carriers and talked about that, but there's hundreds of covers with local delivery, private company stamps, and carrier government carrier stamps that are in combination.
I think with that, I think I've gone through most of the questions in the question box. On behalf of the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and our special co-sponsor this year, the American Philatelic Classics Society, we'd like to thank Gordon for this talk this evening.